The lake had always been a place of peace, a hidden gem tucked away from the bustle of everyday life. It was a small, serene community, surrounded by trees that reflected perfectly on the mirror-like water. Most of the residents knew each other, and the homeowners association was the glue that, for better or worse, kept the neighborhood in order. That sense of order, however, came at a cost, and in this neighborhood, the cost was often dictated by a few people with more authority than sense. Among them was Karen, a name whispered cautiously among residents whenever tensions flared. Karen had the kind of personality that made rules seem personal, and she took her position in the HOA more seriously than most would ever consider healthy. To her, every lawn, every dock, every dockside grill had to conform to her vision of perfection. For her, the HOA was less about community and more about control. I had moved to the area a few months ago, acquiring a small cluster of properties around the lake. Most of them were rentals, modest homes with neat gardens and friendly tenants, but I also owned the property next to Karen. At first, she had seemed harmless enough, a neighborly smile, polite greetings at community meetings. But within weeks, her true colors began to show. It started innocently. A casual mention that the Lake HOA required mandatory membership and fees. I had politely declined, explaining that I was content managing my properties independently. For Karen, that was unacceptable. Her eyes would narrow when she mentioned it, her tone sharpening as she recited the rules and regulations, quoting bylaws as if they were scripture. She made it clear she expected compliance. The tension simmered quietly for a while. There were a few passive-aggressive comments, little digs about community spirit and being a good neighbor, but I maintained my composure. I had learned long ago that engaging with people like Karen only escalated situations. I focused on maintaining my properties, keeping tenants happy, and enjoying the calm of the lake. But calm lakes rarely stay calm forever. It was a Thursday morning when things began to spiral. Karen approached me, her posture stiff, her expression tight with barely contained indignation. She demanded yet again that I join the HOA, insisting it was not optional and that she would take matters into her own hands if necessary. I listened, again refusing politely but firmly, explaining that my properties were my own, and HOA membership did not apply to me in the way she assumed. She didn't like that answer. In fact, she seemed shocked that anyone could ignore her authority, that someone could exist outside her meticulously controlled world. She left with a warning tone, but I felt the storm brewing. 2 days later, I noticed something unusual. A car parked at the end of my driveway, engine running, but no one inside. It wasn't unfamiliar vehicles from tenants or visitors. This one had a local police sticker, and though I didn't think much of it at first, the unease settled in my chest. Something was coming, and I could feel it. By Saturday, the confrontation had escalated beyond anything I could have anticipated. Karen had called the police, claiming that I was violating HOA rules and refusing to cooperate. They showed up in full force, officers walking the perimeter of my property, eyes scrutinizing every detail. I had nothing to hide, of course, but the audacity of it left a bitter taste in my mouth. She had weaponized her entitlement, calling law enforcement over something entirely fabricated. The officers approached calmly, asking questions about the HOA membership and my intentions with the property. I explained everything: ownership, management, and the fact that I had no legal obligation to join her HOA. They listened politely but skeptically, having been conditioned by decades of HOA disputes that usually lean toward neighborly conflicts. Karen's claims, however, were shaky at best. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting golden streaks across the water, I realized that this was not just about HOA fees or rules. It was about power, about someone trying to assert dominance over property they did not own. Karen had assumed that authority gave her ownership of everyone's compliance, but she had underestimated one critical fact: I owned the house directly next to hers, and with ownership came leverage she had no idea about. That evening, after the police left, I walked along the edge of my property, watching the ripples in the water. The neighborhood seemed quiet, almost serene, but beneath the surface, tension coiled like a spring. Karen had made a grave miscalculation, and I knew the next move would determine the course of the conflict. She thought she could intimidate me, she thought she could wield the HOA like a weapon. But she didn't realize that her world was about to collide with mine in a way that would leave her completely unprepared. And so, as the sky turned crimson and the first stars appeared above the tree line, I prepared myself. The calm of the lake was ending, and the storm that had been building in silence was about to break. Karen had triggered a chain of events she could not foresee, and the coming days would reveal just how badly she had miscalculated. The first chapter of this confrontation had ended, but the story was far from over. The balance of power was shifting, and soon, the entire neighborhood would witness a confrontation that no one could ignore. The following morning dawned bright and deceptively serene over the lake, as if nature itself were mocking the chaos simmering just beneath the surface. The neighborhood, so accustomed to quiet routines and mild disputes, had begun to notice a shift in the energy between properties. Whispers traveled faster than ever, neighbors speculated about the police visit, the HOA notices, and the increasingly tense interactions between Karen and me. Yet few understood the magnitude of what was unfolding, and fewer still could anticipate the firestorm about to erupt. Karen arrived early, striding purposefully toward my property with her clipboard clutched tightly. Her expression was taut, every line in her face a testament to determination, and perhaps frustration. She had been thwarted before, police visits and legal notices had produced no immediate results, but she refused to relent. She believed in the moral authority of the HOA, convinced that it granted her power beyond reason, beyond legality even. I, on the other hand, maintained my composure. I had anticipated this moment, and while she thought she held the upper hand, I was armed with something far more formidable than intimidation or official documents. Ownership. The deeds, the legal rights, the meticulous records of every property boundary, they were all in my favor. She, by contrast, had built her authority on assumption, ego, and coercion. By late morning, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered again, drawn by curiosity, speculation, and a desire to witness what they hoped would be a resolution. They whispered among themselves, some nodding in approval as I calmly walked the perimeter of my property, others glancing nervously at Karen, who seemed increasingly desperate. Her presence was more theatrical than functional, a performance intended to establish dominance. Yet dominance requires recognition, and in this case, it was missing. Karen began marking what she claimed were violations of HOA rules. Fences, landscaping, dock placement, every detail was scrutinized, measured, and assessed. Each mark she made, however, was erroneous. She misread the guidelines, applied them to areas outside HOA jurisdiction, and in her zeal, exposed her ignorance. I documented each misstep, capturing photographs, measurements, and time-stamped notes. Evidence was accumulating, silently building a case not only against her claims but against her credibility. By noon, frustration had begun to show in Karen's body language. She paced more frequently, waved her arms for emphasis, and muttered under her breath, unaware that her theatrics were only strengthening my position. She had called the cops once, thinking law enforcement would validate her authority. She had issued notices, believing bureaucratic intimidation would force compliance. Now, standing before her own neighbors, she confronted the unassailable reality of legal ownership, and her audience could see it. It was at this moment that I decided to escalate, but with precision and control. I revealed a key detail that Karen had entirely overlooked. I owned the property she lived in. The very house she had been using as a platform for intimidation, the property she assumed was part of her domain, belonged to me. Her jaw tightened, her eyes widened, and for the first time, her confidence faltered. The crowd murmured, realizing the dramatic shift taking place. The tables had turned, and Karen's power, which had seemed absolute, now appeared tenuous. The police, who had returned in response to new complaints, watched silently. They were aware of HOA disputes, the legal gray areas, and the theatrics of entitlement. But ownership was a fact, concrete and undeniable. The shift was instantaneous. Where Karen had wielded intimidation, she now faced the cold, factual authority of property law. Karen's reaction was immediate and visceral. She attempted to argue, to maintain control, but every point she made was undermined by the simple fact of ownership. I remained calm, measured, and deliberate, countering every claim with documentation, facts, and reason. The neighborhood observed quietly, the tension thick and electric, as one woman's assumption of authority crumbled before their eyes. By late afternoon, Karen retreated, her defeat partial but palpable. She had lost the battle in plain view of neighbors, the police, and herself. The humiliation was visible in every rigid line of her posture, in the way she avoided eye contact, in the abrupt retreat toward her property. Yet, as any seasoned observer would know, this was not the end. Defeated in one encounter, she would regroup, seeking another opportunity to assert dominance, to reclaim perceived power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, I walked along the water's edge, reflecting on the day's events. The confrontation had escalated far beyond what I initially expected. Karen had underestimated me, misjudged her authority, and revealed the weakness of her assumptions. But the conflict was not over. The neighborhood had witnessed the first blow, the first decisive moment, and the stage was set for the next act. The calm of the lake belied the storm that would follow. Karen, humiliated yet determined, would not vanish quietly. Her next move would be more aggressive, more calculated, and potentially more dangerous. And I, armed with legal authority, composure, and meticulous preparation, was ready. The battle lines were drawn, the players clear, and the tension was palpable. As darkness settled over the water, I understood one undeniable truth. The conflict with Karen had become larger than just one property, one HOA, or one dispute. It was now a spectacle, a test of power, control, and intellect. And in this game, every move mattered, every detail counted, and the next chapter promised revelations that would leave the entire neighborhood in shock. The morning after the police visit, the neighborhood felt unnaturally still, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of the coming storm. Birds circled overhead, their chirping subdued, and even the rustle of leaves seemed tentative, almost cautious. Karen's audacity had set off a ripple that extended beyond our properties, and I could sense the subtle changes in the way neighbors glanced at one another. Rumors traveled fast in small communities, and while most residents had no idea what had truly transpired, their curiosity was palpable. I spent the early hours reviewing my properties, checking for any signs of interference or tampering. Nothing was amiss, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Karen was relentless, and her definition of neighborly duty was skewed to the point of obsession. She had weaponized the HOA rules not just against me, but potentially against anyone who dared question her authority. This wasn't just petty drama, it was a calculated attempt to assert control. By late morning, I received the first subtle indication that Karen wasn't done. A notice had been slipped under my door, an official-looking document demanding compliance with HOA regulations. It was filled with jargon and legal references, each line meticulously designed to intimidate. The language made it sound as though failure to comply could result in fines, penalties, or worse. Yet, the document contained a glaring flaw. It assumed authority over a property that wasn't legally under the HOA's jurisdiction. I studied the notice carefully, noting the inaccuracies and the overreach. It was clear that Karen had enlisted help, possibly from other members of the HOA or legal advisors, in an attempt to fortify her claims. She had no intention of simply asking, she wanted to corner me, to make me submit to her demands. But her strategy was flawed, built on assumptions and ego rather than facts and law. Word of her actions began to circulate among the residents. Whispers carried through driveways and mailboxes, and soon, a small crowd of neighbors gathered near my property, curious to witness the unfolding drama. Some were sympathetic, quietly acknowledging Karen's overreach, while others were wary, unsure which side to take. The neighborhood had become a stage, and Karen had inadvertently cast herself as both antagonist and spectacle. Determined not to escalate unnecessarily, I continued my routine, maintaining the properties and ensuring tenants felt secure. Yet, beneath the surface, I was strategizing, aware that the next move had to be precise. Karen's sense of entitlement was dangerous, and if left unchecked, it could lead to actions far more disruptive than mere police visits or threatening notices. That afternoon, I noticed Karen pacing near the edge of my property, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for infractions. Her posture was rigid, each movement calculated to intimidate. She seemed convinced that proximity equated to control, that by hovering near my property, she could exert influence. But she had no idea that ownership was a more potent tool than proximity, and that every step she took was moving her deeper into a situation she could not dominate. I documented everything meticulously, photos of her presence, records of the notices, and notes detailing each encounter. In disputes like these, evidence was not just useful, it was essential. Karen thrived on dramatics and assumptions, but facts were unassailable. I knew that when the time came, the truth would not just protect me, it would dismantle the illusion of her authority. As evening approached, I saw Karen retreat to her home, frustrated by the lack of immediate compliance. Her plans for instant control had failed, and the tension in her demeanor was unmistakable. Yet, I knew this retreat was temporary. Karen was not the type to concede gracefully, she was merely gathering energy for the next confrontation. That night, I reviewed my legal documents once more, ensuring every property deed, every rental agreement, and every zoning regulation was in order. Knowledge was power, and I intended to use it wisely. Karen had underestimated me, and her mistake was not in trying to assert control, but in assuming that I was unaware of my rights. By the time the moon rose over the lake, casting silver reflections on the water, I felt a quiet sense of anticipation. The storm that had begun with her initial confrontation was growing, and the next phase would reveal the full scope of Karen's overreach. She had called the cops once, thinking she could intimidate me. She had sent notices, hoping to coerce me. But she had not yet encountered the reality of living next to the landlord she had underestimated. The neighborhood slept under a veneer of calm, unaware that the conflict was far from over. The next day would mark a turning point, a shift in the balance of power that would leave Karen re-evaluating her assumptions. The confrontation was escalating, and the stage was set for a series of revelations that no one, not even Karen herself, could have predicted. In the quiet hours before dawn, I walked along the water's edge, feeling the tension of the coming days settle around me like fog. The lake remained still, reflecting the calm before the next storm. But beneath that serene surface, the currents were shifting, carrying with them a momentum that would soon reach its breaking point. Karen's attempts at control had ignited a fire she could not contain, and the next chapter would prove just how drastically the tables could turn. The following week dawned with a deceptive calm, the kind that often precedes the most intense storms. The lake shimmered under the early sunlight, reflecting the perfectly maintained docks and manicured lawns, but beneath that serene surface, tension had reached a fever pitch. Karen's previous attempts at intimidation and retaliation had failed spectacularly, yet she refused to concede. Instead, her desperation evolved into something more aggressive, more calculated, and far more dangerous. Karen began mobilizing every ounce of influence she believed she possessed. She convened HOA members, held unofficial meetings, and circulated documents detailing her grievances. Each move was strategic, designed to corner me legally, socially, and psychologically. She operated under the assumption that public perception could tilt the balance in her favor, that neighbors who were not fully aware of the legal realities might support her, and that pressure from multiple angles could force me to comply. I anticipated her tactics. My response was not reactionary but measured, methodical, and precise. Every document, every statement, every interaction was documented and cross-referenced against official property records. I communicated with tenants, ensuring they understood the situation and remained insulated from Karen's schemes. I engaged the police in a calm, factual manner whenever she attempted to manipulate law enforcement into participating in her vendetta. My strategy relied on patience and accuracy, two weapons Karen could not easily counter. By midweek, her desperation manifested in direct confrontation. Karen arrived at my property with a small group of HOA enforcers, armed with cameras, notebooks, and an air of moral superiority that she assumed would intimidate. She demanded compliance, citing rules that did not apply and referencing penalties that had no legal basis. Her voice, sharp and accusatory, carried across the property, drawing the attention of neighbors and onlookers who had become unwitting spectators to the escalating drama. I remained calm, walking the perimeter of my property and demonstrating with clear evidence that her claims were baseless. I pointed to deed documents, zoning laws, and official regulations, leaving no room for ambiguity. Each argument she made was methodically dismantled, exposing the flaws in her logic and the overreach in her assumptions. The contrast between her theatrics and my facts was stark, and the neighbors watching began to grasp the reality of the situation. Karen's authority, once assumed and unquestioned, was crumbling before their eyes. Frustration overtook her. Her gestures became more erratic, her voice rising in volume as her claims failed to gain traction. She attempted to provoke a reaction, hoping to elicit an emotional response that could be construed as noncompliance or hostility. But I maintained composure, refusing to be baited, calmly documenting her every move. Each outburst further undermined her credibility, highlighting the gap between her perception of power and the reality of the law. As the confrontation reached its peak, I revealed the ultimate fact that Karen had entirely overlooked: I was her landlord. The revelation landed like a thunderclap, shocking not only her but also the surrounding crowd. The very property she had assumed gave her moral and social authority over me was, in fact, under my control. The implications were immediate and undeniable. Any attempt to coerce, intimidate, or manipulate could have legal consequences she had never anticipated. The crowd of neighbors gasped and murmured among themselves, recognizing the dramatic reversal of power. Karen's expression shifted from anger to disbelief, then to panic. Her previous confidence, built on assumptions and ego, evaporated under the weight of undeniable fact. The police, already aware of the situation, observed silently, recognizing the legitimacy of my claims and the baseless nature of hers. For a moment, time seemed to suspend over the lake. The tension was palpable, the neighborhood caught between spectacle and reality, and Karen stood exposed, her influence shattered in plain view. This was not merely a legal confrontation, it was a social reckoning. The balance of power had shifted completely, leaving her scrambling to salvage what remained of her authority. By evening, Karen retreated in defeat, but the damage had been done. Her efforts to intimidate, coerce, and manipulate had failed, exposing her obsession and misjudgment. The neighborhood, once passive observers, now understood the reality of the conflict. Her actions had not only failed to assert dominance but had publicly revealed the limits of her control and the consequences of overreach. As darkness settled over the lake, I walked along the shore, reflecting on the tumultuous week. The showdown had been intense, but it had achieved what preparation, patience, and meticulous documentation could accomplish: the exposure of a misguided sense of power and the establishment of undeniable authority. Karen had underestimated me at every turn, and her miscalculation had turned a confrontation over HOA rules into a dramatic reversal of power that the entire neighborhood would remember. The calm of the lake returned in appearance only, a deceptive mask over the still churning waters of tension and anticipation. Karen's retreat was temporary, she would undoubtedly contemplate her next move, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The neighborhood now understood that authority built on ego and assumption could not withstand fact, preparation, and composure. The first blows had been struck, the spectacle observed, and the stage set for the final chapter. Karen's next actions, whatever form they might take, would occur under the scrutiny of the community and the clarity of law. The confrontation had reached its climax, and what remained was the inevitable resolution, the final reckoning, and the closure that only truth and authority could deliver. The days following Karen's first humiliating setback were tense and electric, charged with the quiet anticipation of retaliation. The lake, once a haven of serenity, now reflected a simmering tension that ran through the entire neighborhood. Even casual walks along the water's edge carried a subtle unease, a sense that something explosive was looming just out of sight. Karen had tasted defeat, and like a wounded predator, she was determined to strike back. Her retaliation began subtly at first. Notices appeared on my property again, each one more elaborate and legally intimidating than the last. She had clearly enlisted additional support, consulting friends, HOA members, and possibly legal advisors to craft documents filled with complex language designed to confuse and intimidate. Yet her reliance on paperwork over substance only underscored her desperation. Every letter was meticulously documented, photographed, and catalogued, and each one contained the same fundamental flaw: it assumed authority she did not legally possess. Neighbors watched with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Some approached me quietly, expressing sympathy and concern over the mounting tension. Others whispered about Karen's obsession with control, speculating about the lengths she might go to assert dominance. Rumors and conjecture spread rapidly, adding layers of pressure and spectacle to an already volatile situation. In many ways, the neighborhood had become a theater, with Karen performing a dramatic and increasingly erratic role. Karen escalated further. She began inspecting my properties at odd hours, pacing along fences, and scrutinizing docks as if expecting evidence of wrongdoing to materialize overnight. Her behavior was intrusive, yet there was no violation to be found. Every boundary, every structure, every detail complied fully with laws and regulations. Her obsessive focus revealed nothing but her own impatience and ignorance, and it became clear that she had no actual leverage. Despite her provocations, I maintained calm. I understood that escalation required control and strategy, not reaction. Every misstep by Karen was an opportunity, every overreach a weakness to be documented. I gathered evidence meticulously, from photographs to detailed logs of her appearances and actions. It was a slow, deliberate accumulation of facts, each piece strengthening my position while exposing the instability of her campaign. By midweek, Karen's frustration had become palpable. Her confrontations with the HOA had proven fruitless, and her previous intimidation tactics had failed spectacularly. She was running out of avenues for exerting control. Desperate to reclaim authority, she attempted to involve local law enforcement again, claiming ongoing violations and alleging non-compliance with HOA mandates. But each claim crumbled under scrutiny. Officers, now familiar with the situation, approached her allegations with measured skepticism, aware that she was attempting to weaponize bureaucracy rather than enforce legitimate rules. The tipping point came one afternoon when Karen attempted a direct confrontation near my primary property. She arrived with a small entourage of HOA members, cameras, and papers, each participant seemingly eager to witness my supposed transgression. The neighborhood had gathered once more, drawn to the spectacle, their attention fixated on the unfolding drama. Karen's presence, once imposing, now seemed desperate, calculated, and unconvincing. I addressed the crowd in my own way, not with words, but through actions. I demonstrated compliance, integrity, and calm authority. I pointed to property boundaries, referenced official deeds, and showed clear documentation of every claim and regulation. The onlookers could see the stark contrast between her assumptions and my facts, between her theatrics and my legal authority. Karen's carefully constructed facade of power began to crumble before their eyes. By evening, she retreated, visibly shaken but far from defeated. Her eyes flickered with anger and disbelief, and her posture radiated tension. She had underestimated the depth of preparation, the power of legal ownership, and the impact of public scrutiny. The neighborhood, once passive observers, had now become witnesses to her decline in authority, their awareness subtly shifting the social dynamics of the community. As darkness fell over the lake, I walked along the shoreline, reflecting on the unfolding conflict. Karen's retaliation had revealed both her desperation and her vulnerability. Each aggressive act had inadvertently strengthened my position, turning her own tactics against her. Yet I knew the danger was far from over. She was not someone who would concede gracefully, and her next move would likely escalate further, potentially involving legal maneuvers or personal provocations designed to intimidate. The calm, reflective waters of the lake now mirrored a world on edge. What had begun as a simple dispute over HOA membership had evolved into a battle for control, for reputation, and for dominance. Karen had learned that authority cannot be assumed, that intimidation cannot replace legal power, and that one miscalculated move can unravel years of perceived influence. The stage was set for the next confrontation. Karen's retaliation had failed to achieve her goals, but it had revealed her true nature, ruthless, relentless, and oblivious to the limits of her authority. And as the first stars appeared over the lake, I knew that the next chapter would bring revelations even more dramatic, exposing the extent of her misjudgment and her underestimation of me as both a property owner and a strategist. The quiet before the next storm stretched over the neighborhood, deceptive in its tranquility. Yet beneath the surface, currents of tension swirled, carrying with them the inevitability of a dramatic escalation. Karen's retaliation had been only the beginning, and the coming days promised confrontations that would leave the entire community shaken. The neighborhood awoke the next morning under a quiet tension that felt heavier than any storm. The lake mirrored the sky's muted gray, its calm surface hiding the turbulence that had consumed the community over the past weeks. Karen's retreat the previous evening had been noticeable, her absence at her usual morning walks or routine inspections signaling that she was regrouping, planning, or simply absorbing the consequences of her public humiliation. Yet even in retreat, the air was thick with anticipation. I spent the morning reviewing my properties, checking boundaries, confirming all documentation, and preparing for the inevitable follow-up. Karen's miscalculations had been spectacular, but she was not someone to vanish quietly. Her obsession with control and authority made her unpredictable, and her sense of entitlement could lead to actions far beyond reason. Preparation, patience, and clarity were my shields, and every measure had been taken to ensure that the conflict would not escalate into chaos. By mid-morning, Karen made her move. She approached my property cautiously, her posture tense, her face flushed with residual frustration. She carried a new set of documents, more elaborate than any before, likely prepared with legal advice. Her entourage was smaller this time, perhaps a reflection of waning neighborhood support, or perhaps an indication that she now relied solely on what she perceived as moral authority. I remained calm, waiting for the confrontation with quiet confidence. Karen attempted to assert dominance once more, citing alleged violations, deadlines, and fines. She spoke with urgency, but her words lacked substance. The neighborhood watched, silent but attentive, sensing the final act of this long-simmering drama. Every gesture, every claim, every argument she presented crumbled under scrutiny, exposed as attempts to intimidate rather than enforce. At the critical moment, I reminded her of the most important fact. the one she had failed to consider in all her schemes and confrontations. I was her landlord. Every claim she made against me, every notice, every call to law enforcement, existed in a context where she was subject to my authority. Ownership was the unassailable truth that no amount of ego, assumption, or bureaucratic manipulation could override. The realization hit her instantly, visible in the tightening of her jaw, the widening of her eyes, and the faltering of her stance. The neighbors, once bystanders, now witnessed the complete reversal of power. Karen's attempts at coercion, intimidation, and spectacle had backfired. Her authority had been built on assumptions, but facts were immutable. Each HOA document, each threat, each argument she had relied upon evaporated in the light of undeniable reality. She was not a figure of authority here, she was a tenant of the very property she had tried to control. By afternoon, Karen's retreat was definitive. She left her documents behind, abandoned her entourage, and returned to her home in a subdued and frustrated silence. The lake, calm as ever, reflected the setting sun, but the community had been changed. Neighbors exchanged nods of recognition, their perception of the balance of power now clear. The conflict, once dominated by Karen's sense of entitlement, had been resolved by preparation, legality, and composure. In the following days, the HOA quietly acknowledged the limits of their authority over my properties. Karen's attempts to rally support, intimidate tenants, or enforce compliance were met with polite but firm refusals. The neighborhood had witnessed a spectacle of power and misjudgment, and the lesson was clear: assumptions about authority can crumble when confronted with fact and preparation. Karen, once a figure of intimidation, had become a cautionary tale about ego, overreach, and the limits of perceived control. Walking along the lake that evening, I reflected on the series of confrontations. Each encounter had been a test, each escalation a challenge that required strategy, calm, and clarity. Karen's behavior had been unpredictable, aggressive, and relentless, but her misjudgment had turned her own efforts into a public lesson. The lake, serene and reflective, mirrored the resolution that had been achieved, the equilibrium of power restored, and the spectacle concluded. The neighborhood, once a stage for confrontation, now returned to quiet normalcy. Conversations shifted from speculation about disputes to appreciation for the calm, and Karen, though still present, had lost her ability to dominate, manipulate, or intimidate. The resolution was not loud or dramatic, but it was complete, founded on the undeniable reality of ownership and the careful exercise of authority. In the end, the story of the Lake HOA was more than a tale of conflict. It was a narrative about power, ego, and preparation. Karen had assumed she could control, coerce, and command, but her assumptions were shattered by facts and composure. The neighborhood had observed the full arc of drama, from initial confrontation to escalating retaliation, to public showdown, and finally, reckoning. And as the sun set over the calm waters, the lesson was clear: authority built on entitlement is fragile, but truth, preparation, and patience are unassailable. The lake returned to its peaceful state, the neighborhood to its routines, and I continued managing my properties with quiet authority, secure in the knowledge that facts and preparation had prevailed over ego and intimidation. The story had concluded, leaving a lasting impact on all who witnessed it. If you love wild HOA showdowns, don't just watch, smash that like, hit subscribe, and share this chaos with everyone who loves drama.